I have a 2022 Yamaha Tenere 700 with just over 5,000 miles on it, and a 2023 Aprilia Tuareg with just over 11,000 miles on it. So how do these bikes stack up? Let's get to it. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. On my left here, I have a 2022 Yamaha Tenere 700 that I purchased in April of 23. I have just over 5,000 miles on this bike. And then here on my right, I have a 2023 Aprilia Tuareg 660 that I purchased in April of 2024. And I have just over 11,000 miles on this bike. So between these two bikes, I have quite a bit of experience riding both long distance travel and quite a bit of off-road. So I'm gonna do a comparison of these two bikes. If these are bikes that maybe you own one or the other, or are considering buying one or the other, you know what to expect. So let's get into seeing how these bikes compare. The Yamaha Tenere 700 is a 698cc parallel twin 270-degree crank engine producing approximately 72 horsepower. Now, the way that this delivers its horsepower, it is very linear over the entire RPM range. You won't feel a kick from it at any point in the RPM range. As you roll on the throttle and you increase the RPMs, it's gonna feel very, very smooth, very tractable, and very controllable throughout that RPM range. So very smooth engine, easy to handle. The Aprilia Tuareg is a 658cc parallel twin with a 270-degree crank as well. It produces approximately 78-80 horsepower. Now, the difference between this bike and the other bike is this has electronic ride modes. So in those 4 different modes, the throttle mapping can be changed. And with changing the throttle mapping, it will affect how this engine feels. Now, I will say if you have it set so that you get full throttle at your wrist, at the throttle itself, and full power delivery, this bike has an incredible kick around 5,500 to 6,000 RPM. It feels a little bit like a power band. So if you're ripping and once it gets to that point, the bike kind of feels like it wants to jump out from underneath you and get going, which I find to be extremely fun, especially if you're doing a lot of riding through canyons and twisties, or if you really need to pass somebody, it has a pretty good kick there, which makes this engine very lively and fun. Engine performance and feel of these two bikes, in my opinion and my experience, is very, very different. The Tenere 700, when it comes off of idle, the throttle is very, very jerky. It seems like it dumps a lot of fuel and it wants to run real quick out from underneath you at those low RPMs. So it is not a very smooth delivery to get started. Where the Aprilia Tuareg 660, no matter what mode you're in, when you're coming off of idle, it is very controllable, it's very smooth, it's very easy to get going, and you don't have that jerkiness. So this has a much more refined feel than the Tenere 700. All right, we're gonna talk about suspension, which tends to be one of my favorite topics when it comes to motorcycles and riding. This bike is approximately 210 millimeter of travel in the fork and around 200 millimeters of travel in the rear suspension. I will say from the factory, if you weigh more than 170 pounds, this bike is going to feel very undersprung for you. I weigh around 210, and I was really having difficulty riding this off-road with the stock springs. It was using up a lot of its travel, so I had to ride much slower. So one of the things that I did was I put stiffer springs in the front and a stiffer spring on the rear shock. So I went with the Rally Raid in the rear and I think the Yakagar up front to try to get this suspension to perform much better. Now I only spent about $350 to do that. I know other riders are spending thousands of dollars on their suspension. I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to get it to perform better than it was, and really just getting it sprung properly makes a big difference. The other thing that's really nice about this particular bike is the anti-squat suspension design, the way that when you put power to the rear wheel, it lifts the suspension a little, so it's really driving that back wheel into the ground. I notice it some. I feel like I get a little bit better traction out of this, and it helps keep that rear tire planted to the ground. The Aprilia Tuareg comes, if I have it right, and I'll correct it if I'm wrong, 240 millimeter of suspension travel in the forks and in the rear shock. So quite a bit of travel there. Now I will say, of all of the bikes that I have ridden straight from the factory that I've bought, this one comes with the best suspension. It has preload on the front forks, which I don't see on any other bikes. And then of course, full adjustability and preload on the rear shock. Now, with that being said, I've ridden this incredibly hard. It is a really good suspension stock, but even with that being said, I still think it's a bit undersprung for me. So at a minimum, I am planning to replace the front springs on this bike. I might even replace the cartridges. And then I am definitely going to replace the rear spring on this shock so that it's sprung more for my weight, at weighing 210 pounds. And then I carry about 60 pounds of gear. So I want the spring to be sprung right. But with that being said, this suspension right off the factory floor was much, much better than what I got on the Tenere 700 new. The suspension performance between these two bikes in the stock form, the Tuareg is superior over the Tenere just because it's undersprung. But for $350 with new springs, the suspension performance of this is really, really close to what the Tuareg is now. And there's lots of options with both of these bikes. You can spend thousands of dollars on suspension if you really want to. But if you're just looking to ride it the way it is, I think you get more from it stock here, but it doesn't take a lot to get this up close. So there isn't a huge difference in suspension difference if you spend a little bit of money, but I really like how this bike performs over the Tenere. As far as technology goes, you cannot get a more simple bike than the Tenere 700. This particular bike still has the LCD screen on it. I believe the new ones in 2024 have a TFT screen, but there's no other electronics to this other than mandatory ABS, which is just on or off. It is very, very, very basic. It's a no frills bike. So if you're one of those people that are concerned about a bike having a lot of electronics and potential failures, then you may prefer this type of bike. The Aprilia Tuareg is on the opposite end of the spectrum from the Tenere 700. This is a fully featured, highly electronic motorcycle. It has ride modes that you can control: the throttle mapping, the engine braking, the traction control, and the ABS. And in those, there's three predefined modes. There's a little bit of adjustability in there. And then there's a user-defined mode where you can set it up to be whatever you want. So from that standpoint, there's a lot to work with. I also think one of the top features of this bike is electronic cruise control, which I think really steps this bike up into a new category from a comfort standpoint and ease of riding. Now there's also some Aprilia connectivity to the TFT on this screen, but I think you have to pay something for it, and it's not something I really wanted. I do like the TFT on this. It's really easy to read. It's much easier to read than even the LCD screen. Some of the lettering is a bit small. I think for temperature, it's a little bit hard to read. I need glasses. I'm getting older. That's just what happens. But it works okay. So if you like a bike with electronics, you like having rider modes and having all of those features, well, this has all of that. There are other bikes that have turning ABS or lean angle ABS sensing. This doesn't have that, but for the price point compared to this, to those bikes that have that extra feature, it's a big step up, and you do get a lot of electronics with this, which I really enjoy in this bike. So in wrapping up just the electronic side of things, very, very basic, not a lot going on here. Full suite of electronics. So it really depends on where you sit on that, whether you want something that is very, very basic, that you don't have to worry about electronics failure, or that you believe that the electronics that they've been putting on these bikes has been out for long enough, and I have not seen any failures on electronic systems, that you would be willing to try this out. I think the electronics make this ride much, much better, where on this bike, not having some of those things, I think it really misses out, especially when you consider the price difference between these, which I'll get into later. Comfort, ergonomics, and long distance travel on this bike. So the seat on this bike, a lot of people complain about it being very, very hard. whether it be the stock seat or I have the factory low seat. It is hard. I've gotten used to it. It doesn't bother me too much. I can get by with it, but with the low seat and pegs at the standard height, it felt like my knees were bent up a little bit. So I did lower the pegs to try to open up my legs to make them a little bit more comfortable for long distance travel. Another complaint I see with this bike is that the handlebars are very straight. They don't have a lot of sweep. So I've seen other riders complain that they would like a little bit more sweep in the handlebars. So that might be a factor for you if you're going with this bike. The wind and weather protection is not great. I have a windscreen riser on here to try to get it up so I can get wind up over my head. And even with the riser, it's still hitting right about at the top of my visor. And I'm 5'10". So there just isn't a lot of weather protection on this bike. Even with the gas tank and the width on it, when I have ridden in really cold weather or wet weather, I end up being cold and wet from that. So if that is a concern for you and you're gonna be doing a lot of long distance travel and not just spending all your time riding forest roads and off-road, that might be something you wanna consider. There are bigger windscreens that you can put on to try to get some better weather protection. So ergonomics, weather protection, long distance travel on this bike, it is really, really comfortable. For me, I have not wanted to change anything on the ergonomics of this bike. I think the seat height is around 32 inches, so it's really easy to touch. So I haven't felt compelled to put a lower seat on it, which means that I've been able to keep the distance from the seat to the pegs the same. Now, if I'm riding 400, 500 mile days, my knees do get a bit sore. I just need to stop a little bit more. But the position of my feet to my butt, the way it sits on here is very, very comfortable. And then the position, the placement of the handlebars has been great. I have not once thought that I wanted to put risers on this. I have not wanted to bring the bars back at any point. Even when I'm standing to ride off-road, everything here fits me perfectly. And like I mentioned, I'm 5'10". My arms are a little bit longer than someone of my height. I have a shorter torso and longer legs as well. So I have about a 33-inch inseam. This bike fits me perfectly. Now, for wind protection, the wind buffeting, the screen is a little bit low for me. If I don't have this additional screen when I'm riding roads, I get the buffeting right about at my visor, which is a bit annoying because it's loud and then it knocks my head around. So I have to put something else on here if I'm going to be doing long days on the road. When I get off road, pop it off, not a problem. So from a comfort standpoint, this bike is fantastic in that standpoint. And ergonomics, for me, it fits me really well. Haven't wanted to change a thing. So between these two bikes with the ergonomics, the comfort, long distance touring, travel, this bike stock is more comfortable than the Tenere, partly because the seat height on this is, I think it's close to 34 inches. And then the way the handlebars are and the lack of wind protection over this. And if you're gonna be doing long distance travel, you cannot put a price on electronic cruise control. Having electronic cruise control on this makes it a much easier bike to put 400 or 500 miles a day on, where this bike, when I have done 500 mile days, there's some suffering that goes on because I don't have cruise. It's just the layout, the setup isn't exactly comfortable, and I'm getting blasted with wind all day long. So comfort, long distance, ergonomics, I think stock form, for me, my height, this is a better bike than the Tenere 700. The overall riding experience for this bike, the best way I can describe it is it has a very agricultural feel. Now I know that that's going to offend some Tenere 700 owners, and it has when I've said that in the past. The controls feel very clunky. The brakes are not terribly strong. The engine, because of the jerkiness off of the throttle, it doesn't feel very refined. And the way I describe riding this bike is it feels a bit like riding a tractor. It gets you from point A to point B. It's not going to do it in any degree of style. It's really just meant to be functional. The one thing that I have noticed when I go between different bikes is because of just the simple basic nature of this bike, it doesn't even have a slipper clutch. And slipper clutches have been around in bikes for a very long time. So for me, when I'm switching between bikes, I don't always remember that this doesn't have a slipper clutch. And sometimes I'll drop that clutch a little too fast, and I've locked up the rear wheel, obviously on dirt roads, but I've even locked up that rear wheel on paved roads if I've dropped too many gears too quickly and drop the clutch because I'm not paying attention. So I think to ride this bike, your focus needs to be very, very high. Your margin for error on this bike is much, much lower. So you really have to pay attention if you're gonna ride this bike. The riding experience on this bike for me has really been remarkable. When I was riding the Tenere 700, I was starting to think that maybe I didn't like riding as much as I thought I did. And I was considering cutting back riding quite a bit. But I did a demo ride on this bike in, I think February or March. And when I got done with the demo ride, I was so blown away. I had made the decision I had to have one of these bikes. And the best way I could describe it is if you've ever ridden BMW R1200 GS, it feels like a miniature version of that, where it's much, much lighter. It's a little bit more compact, the bike itself, but it has the same refined feeling of one of those bikes. And the electronics package was something that I really, really liked. It's an easy bike to ride. It's a very intuitive bike to ride, and it covers up a lot of riding mistakes with the different rider modes. The brakes are incredibly strong. I do one finger braking on the front brakes. They're effective. I've had cars pull out in front of me, and I've been able to get stopped in time. Just, drivers do weird things, but I really feel like I'm in control of this bike. I find it to be extremely easy to ride, both on-road and off-road. I have ridden stuff on this bike that I don't think I could have successfully navigated through on other bikes that I ride, especially not as easy as I have on this. So the overall riding experience for this bike has been outstanding. And so far in the 11,000 miles that I've put on this bike, out of the variety of bikes I've had over the last 10 plus years, this has been my favorite bike from that standpoint. Overall riding experience on these two bikes, if you are a very competent rider, you will get a lot out of this bike. If you're a newer rider, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend this bike because it really takes a level of focus and control that if you lose that focus, you could find yourself in a bad situation. Where with the electronics package on this bike, the riding experience, this will make up for a lot of mistakes that you may make, whether it be from braking or throttle or just things that you do on the bike. I think especially long distance travel, much better here than this bike. The wind protection, just kind of the ergonomics of it and the feel of it. The other thing I'll mention about these bikes is this bike feels faster to ride through corners. It feels like it has a little bit more flick to it. I think part of that is the way that these bikes carry their weight. The Tuareg carries its weight lower because of the way the fuel tank is designed. It is down under, goes partly under the seat, where the Tenere 700, the fuel tank is quite high. And because of that, the weight feels much higher because it is. And when you're trying to lean back and forth, you have more movement that you've got to do. You got more inertia to overcome, flicking it back and forth through the corners. So I think this bike is a much faster bike to ride if you're doing canyon carving in the hands of the right rider. So between these two bikes, I really think for me the overall riding experience has been better here. Clearly, I've put 11,000 miles on this bike in less than 5 months, and I barely put 5,000 miles on this bike in the 17 months I've owned it. There is no doubt that the reputation of the Yamaha Tenere 700 is second to none. The reliability of this bike exceeds every other middleweight bike that I can think of. And of course, I only have 5,000 miles on it. I really haven't had a chance to test out the reliability. But if you look at all the threads and everything that's out there, you're just not seeing a lot of problems with these bikes. So if you're looking for a bike that is rock solid, you'll never have to worry about, then this is a great choice from that standpoint. Yamaha reliability, you really can't beat it. All right, reputation and reliability of the Aprilia, especially the Tuareg 660. Now, if you look at posts out there, you're gonna see when they first brought this bike out, it had oil leaks at different places around the engine. My experience after 11,000 miles is I haven't had any other oil leaks other than one hiccup with a missing spring on the counter shaft during assembly from the factory. I've got a bunch of videos on that. Now, when I did those videos, I got a lot of comments from people saying that they would never ride a European motorcycle, they would never ride an Italian motorcycle, and they especially would not ride an Aprilia. But when I asked them if they have ever owned one or what their riding experience was, it was crickets. Now, I did get a lot of other comments from Aprilia owners and especially Tuareg owners that also had close to 10,000 miles on their bike. And they all reported that they have had trouble-free ownership of that bike. So there is a reputation that Aprilia has as being unreliable, but I don't know if that is well-deserved, if that's just coming from riders who just don't like the idea of a European bike or an Italian bike, maybe have never owned an Aprilia. I don't know where that reputation comes from. But other than that one hiccup that I'm gonna forgive because I've had such a great riding experience, that may be something you wanna consider, is do the research on these bikes. And if you look at the bikes when they first came out, like I said, there was oil problems, but start looking at 2023 bikes and if anyone's reporting any issues in 2024, because the comments I'm receiving is from owners of this bike is they haven't had any issues. I'm sure there are some out there, every bike does, but so far it hasn't been too bad for me, other than that one issue, which, like I said, I am overlooking. If you make your purchasing decisions based on reliability and reputation, then you can't go wrong here. Yamaha bikes are always going to have an outstanding reputation for that reliability, and it's going to overcome any other bike you put up against it. So no matter what I say about either of these bikes, if that matters, this is going to be top of the class when it comes to that. So if that is an important factor for you in purchasing a motorcycle and you don't want to take any risks and see how it really plays out as an owner, this is probably the direction you're going to want to go. Let's talk about the pricing of these two bikes. From what I looked at, the listing for the Tenere 700 is $10,799 without their dealer added on costs and shipping and freight. That's just the retail listing. The Tuareg is $12,299 if I have current data on that. So what is that? $1,500 difference between these two bikes. But let's talk about where those differences come in. The one thing I have not mentioned yet is that the Aprilia Tuareg has cross-spoke tubeless wheels, where the Tenere has tubed wheels. So if you want to mess with tubes when you change tires, you can go here. But if you don't want to have to mess with tubes, for an additional $1,500 between these two bikes, you can get a tubeless setup. Now, I've looked at putting tubeless wheels on this bike, and there are some aftermarket options at a cost of about $3 grand. So keep that in mind. Also on here, you have the electronics package, which is a very significant electronics package. I'm not sure how to put a price on that. If you look at the tubeless wheels and the electronics package, I think the cost of that would exceed the $1,500 difference between these two bikes. So which bike has more value? That might be up to you to decide which one of these two has more value. But for me, I really think there's more value in the Aprilia Tuareg 660 than there is in the Tenere. That's kind of hard for me to say because of the reliability and the reputation that this particular bike has. But when you add up the differences between these bikes and the electronics and the tubeless wheels and the ergonomics and the feel of the bike and the weight of the bike and the suspension of the bike, you really have to start looking at where is their value. For me, value is here. My overall thoughts on these two bikes, I think I've expressed that pretty strongly as we've gone through. If I had to do it all over again and an Aprilia dealer had been in the town that I was living in at the time that I bought this, I never would have bought this bike. I really liked the Tuareg. This was the bike that I wanted, but it wasn't at the time. I didn't think it was going to be available to me, and I didn't want to drive 4, 5, 6 hours to get to a dealership, which I eventually did anyway. But the riding experience is better. I really think there's more value here as well. I think what you get with the Tenere 700 is the reputation and reliability. I really don't think you can buy this bike and ride it in its stock form. It is going to require modifications. And I really think that it takes a much more competent rider to get everything they can out of this bike. Where a mediocre rider is gonna have a great time on this bike and it's gonna keep you out of trouble, which has definitely kept me out of trouble. So anyway, if you own either of these bikes, let me know what you think about a comparison between these two in the comments below. If you're considering either of these two bikes, let me know which way you're leaning before purchasing in the comments below as well. And if you disagree with my position on either of these bikes, let me know that in the comments as well. I have not been very objective in this comparison because of my experience. This bike drove me to almost quit riding, where this bike has drove me to ride all of the time. So it's a very, very different experience. It may not be the same for you as it was for me, but that's where it's led me. Anyway, remember, you can always make more money, but you cannot make more time. So don't pass up that ride. Get out, do some riding, ride safe, and I will see you out there. I'm not sure how to put a price on that, but if you look at the spokeless wheels